Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to Clearer Than the Truth. I'm Nathan Kiker, and today's guest is Tim Bouverie. Tim is the author of Appeasement, Chamberlain, Hitler, Churchill, and the Road to War, and Allies at War. We talk about his work on Hitler, Chamberlain, and Churchill, and what each can teach us about how democracies confront today's authoritarian powers and manage fragile alliances. Tim, thanks for joining us. Tim, I think most people think about the world wars, and they think about, if anything, World War II, easy, World War I, Guns of August, Barbara Tuchman. But I don't think people really spend enough time trying to understand what was in the minds of the leaders at the time. In Appeasing Hitler, you show how British leaders misread Hitler's intentions, even though his goals were pretty clearly stated in word and in deed. I want to tie that to Vladimir Putin. When you look at Vladimir Putin's record since at least 2008, where do you see the closest analogies, and where does the analogy break down?
The analogy is fairly well put together and consistent in that neither Vladimir Putin nor Adolf Hitler were in any way circumspect about their long-term foreign policy goals, about rebuilding a major German empire at the heart of Europe and looking for Lebensraum, an empire based on race and racial inequality, and Vladimir Putin's Russian nationalist desire to recreate the former Tsarist empire and ideally the Soviet Union, if potentially shorn of its Marxist ideology. Nevertheless, publicly they will both say certain things such as, we do not believe in war, we are not the aggressors here, we are more sinned against than sinning, and it's a question of judging them by what they do rather than by what they say, and by judging them on their private reminiscences, be they Mein Kampf, and be they Putin's great essay on his nationalist agenda, and seeing what they also say to their domestic audiences, as opposed to what they say when they're occasionally brought before international media.
I love your use of the leer there, more sinned against than sinning, because I think Angela Merkel loves to use this analogy about Munich, but she seems to use it in this really disturbing sort of way. I'm sure you saw the Netflix film, which many of our listeners in the U.S. will be familiar with, but she seemed to sort of invoke the specter of Munich to describe appeasement as actually a kind of heroic act in certain instances. Do you think kind of the analogy is up for grabs now? Or do you think that there's still a valuable way of applying it?
I don't see any way that Munich is rehabilitable, if that's a word. I think that it is not just morally bankrupt, it's strategically inept. It ensures that when Britain and France eventually do go to war, they are having to fight a one-front war as opposed to potentially a two-front war with Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. It convinces Stalin that the West will always appease Hitler, and that his best option, therefore, is to make a deal with Hitler, which is what he begins to do in the spring of 1939, culminating in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The idea that this was Neville Chamberlain playing a clever game, that he was trying to get Britain ready for a war which he knew would happen, is complete balderdash. Neville Chamberlain told his closest associates following Munich that he believed that this was peace for our time. He said it publicly. He wouldn't have given that hostage to fortune had he thought it was only going to be peace for another 12 months. And when he was asked to expedite British rearmament following the Munich Agreement in preparation for this war, which so his later-day apologists would suggest he was anticipating, he refused, and it took further German aggression, both at home and abroad, for the British to really prepare for war.
I guess, I'd love to switch gears just briefly and kind of talk about, we're in this moment of crisis, I think, surrounding the Western alliance. There's a great deal of consternation, I think, within NATO. And I wonder whether, your second book, published last year, really can tell us something about the politics of managing alliances, and whether there might be any sort of less well-known analogies for us to draw there.
It's both complex and simple. The complexities of alliances are many and multifaceted, and that is what my book is about. It's about the difficulties of the alliance which ultimately defeated Hitler, which ultimately defeated Imperial Japan, and which ultimately defeated fascist Italy, and about how countries which have different political systems, different ideologies, different aims, different imperial records, how they managed to collaborate briefly and successfully militarily, and to a certain extent laid the foundations for the post-war order. But while that in and of itself and every issue is complex, they did themselves, I think all leaders came back to the central truism, which is something that Churchill repeatedly stated throughout the Second World War, which is that there is only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that is fighting without them. Nazism could not be defeated without allies. And the great challenges that we face now, not just as the West, but as a planet, from most notoriously climate change, can only be dealt with on a multilateral international basis. There is nothing that a single nation, with the possible exception of the United States and China, can do to solve most of the world's major problems.
Fascinating.
Do relationships in alliances, personal relationships, still matter? Henry Kissinger would always make the point that every country would act in its best interests and sort of a winner-take-all approach, and that it didn't matter if he had a good relationship with the Chinese leader or the Russian leader, despite his personal need for affirmation. He would just argue that these countries had that personal diplomacy and personal relationships were not important. Did that matter in World War II? Did the relationships between like Churchill and Roosevelt actually matter?
Generally, I'm of the Kissinger view that it's not that they don't matter, but the practitioners of high-level diplomacy greatly exaggerate their importance. And this is vanity. It's a trap of vanity which statesmen and politicians have fallen into time after time after time. Neville Chamberlain kidded himself that he had managed to exert some sort of influence and built a relationship with Adolf Hitler. Churchill, and even more so Roosevelt, kidded themselves at various points of the Second World War that they were developing a genuine comradely relationship based on shared values with Stalin. And we know how that turns out. On the other hand, this early stage of the war, where there was a very clear unifying goal and a great danger at various points of the war, and debates on strategy, I think it was significant that Churchill did have a good personal relationship with Roosevelt. Not all the way through. It's been much romanticized, and it's too often been seen as consistent. I would say that the Churchill-Roosevelt relationship peaked in the winter of 1942, moving into 1943. But nevertheless, the influence that Churchill had over Roosevelt during the period of 1941, 1942, was, I think, of great importance for Western military strategy, and before that had been of a certain importance in gaining as much aid as possible from the United States for Britain, although Churchill ultimately failed in his policy of trying to drag the United States into war. It was not Churchill's persuasiveness that brought America into war. It was, of course, the Japanese.
On the flip side, and George, feel free to, I don't mean to take all the questions, but on the flip side, do relationships with your enemies matter? I think that's sort of the Donald Trump approach we're seeing right now, where he thinks there's a value to being close with Vladimir Putin or, Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Is there a strategic value in that? And have we seen this throughout history in the past?
Well, two things on that. Firstly, does the president see these people or these nations as enemies? There's no great indication that he sees Vladimir Putin or the Russian Federation as an enemy. But let's just say that the White House or the US in general should or does take the same view of people in Europe, that Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation under his control wish nothing but ill for the democratic West, then what is it that can be said that the president has got out of Putin, out of appeasing him, out of allowing him to continue his war in Ukraine, out of his summit with him in Alaska? He's given him great photo ops. He's brought him in from the cold. He's berated his major adversary in the Oval Office. What has the West, or what has America gained from this? How close are we to peace from this? How more dangerous or less dangerous is the world as a result of all this diplomacy? So I can't see a single instance in which, either today or in the past, where appeasing would-be foes pays off.
Well, look, I'm no defender of Donald Trump's, but I think one could say he's not necessarily appeasing Putin. He has provided weapons, not enough, but weapons to Ukraine. And having that relationship with Putin where he can call him on his cell phone and sort of make some loose demands, I think you could argue makes the world moderately safer for the short term by having that relationship. I would doubt that a Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or Joe Biden would have the same ability to actually bring Putin to the table at all. Would you disagree with that?
And to a certain extent, I would disagree with that. What is bringing Putin to the table is not so much that he thinks that he must have a good relationship with the current US president and that this is something that is of great benefit to him, but the current US president is erratic and unpredictable, and that is frightening if you are a chess player of Putin's caliber. You don't know what your adversary is going to do, and toe for toe, economically and militarily, this is not an even match. The US is so much more sophisticated and so much more powerful than the Russian Federation is. This is not John F. Kennedy Khrushchev situation. This is completely different. The world is not threatened in the same way by Russia as it was, which is ironic because it should make this conflict a conflict much easier to solve, and it needs to be solved in the same way that the Soviet Union came to an end, which is the realization of certain senior people, ultimately Gorbachev, that this arms race, this permanent antagonism was not in their best interest and ultimately not a contest that they could win. So I think it is more fear of what could this highly volatile president do should he fall out of favor with Vladimir Putin, should he realize that he's being strung along and that Vladimir Putin has no interest in peace whatsoever, and certainly no interest in respecting a independent Ukrainian state on his doorstep, that brings him to the table. But it hasn't really brought him to the table. Where is the table? The table was, we were promised joint meetings between Zelensky and Putin following the Alaska summit. They haven't happened. Every time further concessions are made by one side, Putin goes further and the rhetoric about nuclear weapons and war in Europe increases. There could be as many meetings in Geneva or Saudi Arabia or Turkey or wherever you like. But thus far, I don't think anyone in Europe, and a lot of people in America as well, think that Putin has moved really 1 inch closer to a peace deal.
I suppose I have to take some issue with your characterization of Trump as an appeaser. I mean, he's just taken off the board a major proxy of President Putin in the Western Hemisphere. And he's done this seemingly, with the provocation of Putin's swatting away the last proposed deal. I also think President Putin plays an enormous role in destabilizing world politics beyond Ukraine, but perhaps that's neither here nor there. I mean, I would say that I think where the analogy about Munich begins to fray for me is, as you say, at the end of the Cold War, you have figures like Margaret Thatcher insisting that Germany cannot be reunified, but ultimately accepting at the kind of insistence of her allies that, no, in fact, this is not a kind of appeasement, that this is a necessary instrument for the kind of creation of a whole and free Europe. Do you think that we have to, be careful when we apply this analogy, or, is there room to always kind of bring it to the conversation?
We have to be extremely careful, and many of the major disasters that, in my view, have occurred in international history since the Munich conference all come from misinterpretations of this analogy. I happen to think that any sellout of Ukraine to the aggression of Russia is a pretty direct analogy with Munich. The Margaret Thatcher not wanting to unify Germany, I see no analogy whatsoever, because Germany was not and is any sort of threat. This is that was based on an ancient anti-Teutonic prejudice of the Prime Minister, and a very personal one, which had no support in her own cabinet or party, let alone in other parts of the world and the White House. No, if we look at it, I think people always learn the lessons from the wrong war. Or, sorry, to put it better, and maybe you might like to edit this, I think that people consistently learn the wrong lessons from the last war. In the 1920s, there was an understandable post-mortem on the causes of the First World War. This could never happen again. And the amount of studying as to why this had happened generally brought about a certain number of salient themes. The first one was that alliances had caused the First World War. All right, well, we're not going to have alliances. So there was no unified containment system of a resurgent Germany. Secondly, it had happened because of an arms race. Okay, disarmament is going to be the order of the day. And then the British and the French failed to realize that it was simply a unilateral disarmament once Germany began rearming in the 1930s. Counterwise, the idea that appeasement had failed, that Munich was shameful, all of which is true, led to a series of disasters after the Second World War, when Anthony Eden went in and invaded Egypt with the connivance of Israel and France, because he saw another mustachioed dictator behaving arbitrarily in the Middle East. That was a disaster. I think you can see an analogy with Vietnam, and I think you can see an extremely clear analogy with Iraq in 2003, another mustachioed dictator who was often compared to the dictators of the past. And George W. Bush, again, spoke of the men of Munich and where they had gone wrong, and this was the time that the United States was not going to go down that path.
No, I mean, I think that's extremely well taken. I mean, I want to return just sort of briefly to the question of alliance management, because, I think this week will be in part dominated by, the statements coming out of the White House about Greenland, and how, aghast various allies in NATO will be at these sort of assertions by President Trump's inner circle. But I want to ask, about the ugly side of alliance management. And I think that we have examples from Churchill, like Mersel Kabir, where he's forced by circumstances to destroy French ships in the Mediterranean that might fall into German hands. But if we look at the kind of lineage of that leader specifically, we also have kind of his forebearer, who he really admired, Lord Marlborough, kind of having to march on the Danube and kind of not only deceive his foes, but also his friends. And so I wonder whether, you in being a scholar of this kind of set of dynamics, have seen any relevant analogies to sort of the deception that is often maligned coming out of the United States now towards its friends. Or am I totally off base by raising either of those examples?
I think there isn't a clear analogy. I think the difference is, when you're in a war situation or a potential war situation, the utilitarian argument can supersede other arguments, and the potential and your appetite for risk becomes considerably less, and many of the normal rules of engagement cease to apply. And there are all sorts of moral blurrings of the line, not just diplomatically, but militarily, that occur on the Allied side, including the so-called strategic bombing of Germany, and later indeed the firebombing of Japan. The huge difference, and what is, I think, really concerning other members of NATO and other members of Europe with today and what is happening with the current US administration, is, one, there does not seem to be unity necessarily as to who the enemy is. And that is what we've seen in the Oval Office row with Zelensky. That's what we seem to see with the currying favor of Vladimir Putin and other so-called strongmen. I actually think we should stop calling them strongmen. I don't think that sending rockets into hospitals and children's schools is a sign of strength. So firstly, are we aligned on who the enemy is? And however unaligned the US, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire were on tons of other aspects of the Second World War, everyone was aligned on who the primary enemy was at that time. And secondly, is there a strategic view about the sort of world that we wish to see operating and how it should operate? For example, let's take this most current bit of news, the capture of President Maduro in Venezuela. I don't know anyone of left or right, apart from a small fringe of the far left in Britain, who would in any way think that the removal of Maduro as president of Venezuela is not a fantastic move and potentially very good news for the people of Venezuela. But there are also worrying implications or consequences of this. Where does this? Is this a foretaste of further unilateral action by the US with regard to other countries, not so obviously run by malignant dictators, Greenland, Canada, wherever you might like to think? Is this a part of a deal which would see China take Taiwan and Russia take Ukraine, as long as America can do whatever it likes in the Western Hemisphere? And generally, however unsatisfactory the rules as they're meant to be that have existed since 1945 are, despite their transgression on many occasions, they are there to try and make the world less safe, and not more safe rather than less safe, I should say, and ensure that we don't just live in a world of might is right.
We had a guest on recently who focuses on international law, and one of the things that I asked her was, do you worry that unilateral action by the U.S. actually hurts our ability to maneuver with allies? What is your view on this? You kind of hit on it, but would unilateral action against Maduro sort of weaken our hand with our allies? Because at the end of the day, they still need us. We still have the largest military in the world. We have the most bases, wealthiest country. Does that actually matter in maintaining and building alliances?
I don't think it weakens America's hand with allies. As you say, America is so powerful. You have to only see how careful European leaders are being to not condemn the capture of Maduro, despite the fact that there's deep unease in Europe about it, not because of the capturing of the Venezuelan president, dictator himself, which nobody, I repeat, has any problem with at all as a fact in of itself. But is this a very dangerous precedent for activity which, frankly, probably breaks international law and gives a sort of legitimacy to other acts of international brigandage, be they in the Far East or be they in Eastern Europe? I think it doesn't necessarily harm irreparably relations with America's allies, but it makes America's allies very, very nervous. They weren't aware of this, and maybe that was right for operational reasons, and they probably don't approve it. I think if you ask most European leaders right now whether they would rather we could rewind the last week and have Maduro back where he is from their perspective and not have this dangerous precedent set and not have the implications, real or imagined, of a potential global carve-up, then I think they would take that option. It's not knowing what America might do next, not feeling that America is reliable in the way that America has been before, that America could suddenly lash out in all sorts of different directions. Because Maduro, as I say, Maduro is not someone that has any support in Europe or among most democratic politicians worldwide, but Greenland and the sovereignty of Greenland has huge support in Europe and elsewhere. This is a sovereign country. The people of Greenland want to remain with the sovereignty that they have. The people of Canada want to remain Canadian. I very much doubt if there would ever be a US invasion of Canada, but almost nothing seems impossible these days.
Interesting. Look, one of the striking themes that you've written about is how much wishful thinking there was, is people seeing what they wanted to in Hitler. Where do you see that kind of motivated reasoning at work now in Western attitudes towards Xi or Mohammed bin Salman or other strongmen, though you wouldn't call them strongmen?
Well, I don't think there's very much wishful thinking at all in Europe. The wishful thinking, it seems to me, comes from the other side of the Atlantic, because it's wishful thinking that Putin is a reliable partner, that Putin, having an expanded empire, is either at best no threat to US interests, or possibly even a benefit, that Xi Jinping or that MBS, that sheer cash in a lot of these instances matters more than principles, matters more than the rule of law, matters more than the assassination of opposition leaders or journalists, whoever it may be, that the dollar in Venezuela is more important, and the interests of American companies is more important than a democratic process. I think it's alarmed a lot of people in Europe and elsewhere in the world that the main statements from the White House thus far have been far more about US interim running of the show and US companies coming and sorting out the oil industry, profiting off it, rather than engagement with the legitimate opposition in Venezuela, which is extremely popular and won the last elections before they were overturned by Maduro. So I think it's concerning, and it all comes back to an essential combination of: do we have shared values? What is the West? The West, it's not a geographical conception. It should be a shared set of values. That is what differentiated the West from the East in the Cold War, and that is what is meant to keep the West together soon. And I can't think of any Western leader who, until very recently, would respond to the murder of a journalist who had been a critic of the Saudi regime by saying these sort of things happen and not many people liked him, and sort of giving it an official blessing, even if some extremely ugly things have happened in the past under US and British relations with that part of the world.
Fascinating. Tim, I want to respect your time, but Allies at War is the second in a planned trilogy, I believe I read, on World War II politics. Without giving too much away, what questions about power, democracy, and international order in the 40s are you exploring next that you think speak most urgently to our current political moment?
Well, at the moment, I've just started work on, as you say, the third in this projected trilogy, which is looking at the transition from World War to Cold War, a very specific period from exactly where this book ends, the Yalta Conference, through to the end of the Truman administration and the death of Stalin, by which time the structures of the Cold War, the institutions from the CIA to the German Democratic Republic and the German Federal Republic, these were all established. But it's that period of uncertainty, flux, transition, and war scares, of espionage, that I want to explore. And I want to explore it because I think it has too often been written about as an inevitable sequence of events that came about through the inherent incompatibility ideologically and on a power basis of the Grand Alliance. And yet that is so not how contemporaries saw it at the time. They've continually felt that they were operating in an era of great uncertainty, where critical choices they would make and critical determinations they would make about their opponents' attitudes and aims would determine the course of history, and indeed did.
Okay. Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining us. Where can listeners find your current books, but also your current work?
Any good bookshop, but also online. So the book is Allies at War, How the Struggles Between the Allied Powers Shaped the War on the World, and it's also on audiobook as well as Kindle.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. If you found this conversation helpful, please follow the show, leave a rating or review, and share it with someone who cares about global events.